What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Frankie D'Astoli Show. I am your host, Frankie D'Astoli. I am hyped. I got Bonnie Galam in the studio today. She's about to break it down for some facts. But let me just give you a little bit of background on Bonnie. Bonnie is a real estate investor first. She's a real estate attorney second, and she is a real estate educator by necessity. Bonnie and her husband self-manage a portfolio of over 100 doors in the greater Philadelphia area. And through her experiences as a landlord, Bonnie created a law firm to serve other real estate investors well with their their transactions, their estate planning, and their asset protections needs. However, after several years in private practice, Bonnie saw that conventional law firm approach to asset protection wasn't serving investors completely the way that she wanted. So she decided to create the Landlord Law School, a DIY asset protection program. Bonnie loves to hang out on Instagram. You can find her at Bonnie Galam, ESQ. And she also has her own podcast called House of Horrors. And one thing I will say about Bonnie, just knowing her personally for the past couple of years, she is just one of those people that even when you think she's doing way more than anyone possibly can, she somehow piles on more and gets more done. She's one of the hardest working people that I know. So Bonnie, I'm very excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Frankie. I'm excited to be here. And you forgot on my list of things, investor, attorney, all of that. I'm also just tired. I love what I do. I go to bed happy and tired every night.
That's what's up. That's honestly the goal. I mean, as long as you're going to bed with a smile on your face most of the time, I feel like that's a positive for sure. She also has 3 kids, so you just continue to throw it on. And she's trying to read 52 books. Not trying, I'm sure she'll accomplish it. 52 business books this year, which is just insane. So, but Bonnie, hyped to have you. I think this is going to be really, really valuable because for a few reasons. A, you own a portfolio of 100 doors that you're self-managing, which is going to be so much that we could dive into there. But I think even more so is the asset protection, the attorney background stuff. It just seems very much like as being someone who is, in real estate now and is scaling a portfolio. I feel like when you get into it, a lot of times asset protection falls on the back burner. It's not something that you necessarily think about so much when you're going in. And then you have one instance where a tenant slips and falls, or you have a partnership that falls out, or God forbid, somebody passes away. And it's like, cool, well, what have I done to prepare for this? So if you wouldn't mind, give me a little background on kind of like your attorney life, where you kind of come from and what you really specialize in now.
Yeah. So I was a real estate investor before I was a real estate attorney. I did not go to law school to do this. This was not my plan. I wanted to be a criminal attorney. I wanted to be a prosecutor. And I did that for a few years out of law school. When I was in law school, I met my husband and he was the real estate investor. He was the one who was doing it. Funny story. He owned a lot of, properties near the law school I went to. And when we met, I was kind of afraid he might be my landlord, but he wasn't.
That's wild.
And he wasn't. But I graduate, I passed the bar. I am practicing criminal law. In the meantime, he's, going to tax auctions and he's buying properties, and he was buying properties from a family member. And we were slowly growing this portfolio. And at one point, he quits his job. He was working for a Big Four accounting firm and was like, I'm going full in on this. And I'm like, must be nice. I want to quit my job too, but sure, have at it. So he does that. And not too long after, I want to say probably within a year of that, it had nothing to do with it, but I think some of it was just, we were scaling fast and we were, we had a relationship with an attorney where I think we thought we were checking the boxes and we weren't. And we'll get into that. But we got our first lawsuit. We've been sued more than once, but that was our first. And it was an experience with a contractor, someone who was like a handyman, would come to the properties, do odd jobs, spackle, hang up blinds, change a light bulb, something like that the tenants couldn't do themselves. And it was a few years after we had stopped working with him, and he had alleged that he got hurt on the property and was suing us for that injury, but also suing us for workers' comp. And that was like this whole thing where I was like, what do you mean workers' comp? We weren't your employer. But through that experience, I kind of saw the good side and the bad side. I was like, wow, real estate investing can be something where it's leveraged time, leveraged income to the point where my husband's able to leave his job. But on the flip side, there's a lot of exposure to this if we don't know what we're doing. And I'm a type A lawyer. And so I'm like, I'm the one who does the suing. I do not get sued. This is not how this shakes out. Because that was not on the plan, right? We've got the vision board, we've got, the 10-year plan. Getting sued and like having this house of cards get knocked over is not there.
Yes.
And so I start, listening to Bigger Pockets podcast. I'm, reading books. I'm watching YouTube videos. I'm taking CLEs, like continuing ed for lawyers on asset protection, on real estate. I'm like, I'm going to become the best freaking person at this. And during that time, I will admit, I've always had this dream of creating my own law firm. Did I think it would be doing what I'm doing now? No. But that's how the way life shakes out. Like you just kind of never know when those pivot moments are going to happen. And that lawsuit, hands down, was it for me. And so about a year into this like study and doing things slowly in our own businesses, watching what's happening, getting understanding, I was like, I'm starting my own law firm and I'm going to be the attorney I wish I had as a real estate investor. And so that was 6 years ago now.
Wow.
And the type of practice that I have now are the pain points that I wish I handled better earlier on in our investing career. That was asset protection, estate planning, and transactional, being really, really good at that due diligence, being really good at negotiating the contract up front. So that way the rest of it just kind of all falls into place. And so those are my 3 legal passions.
Yes. Well, that's awesome. And I feel like that's really the best type of attorney to work with, not just kind of promoting you in this sense, but like someone who's been there, someone who's done it, right? Like I feel the same way, like, I've interviewed with like a few, like whether it's lenders or accountants or whatever, you always hear that, they'll try to say like, I was this or I am this. And usually like I find out that for the most part, I have relatively good business relationships with those people because they have done it. They've been in similar shoes. And just being someone who's, made a lifestyle in sales, like one of the things that as a salesman, like I try to put myself in the client's shoes, like what are their actual needs? So being that you have come from that world, you've created this whole entire, process and everything around that world and your experiences, it's really helpful. And I mean, I've known this, I've worked with you directly on some of my real estate deals, and I could attest that it's absolutely truth, right? Like when you've been there and you've done it, you have ways of probing questions to me and to anybody that you work with of, well, have you thought about it this way? What if you think about it, what if you look at it from this lens? Or like, why wouldn't you want to do this? And it makes you think outside the box. It allows you to see things that you maybe didn't see. So that's really awesome. And that's really funny about, you thinking about your husband was your landlord. I mean, maybe you would have got some discount on rent. So maybe that could have worked out great. But in any regard, at least it led to you guys getting married.
Yeah. And thankfully he wasn't my landlord. But, I really appreciate you saying that. I try to post things with a different lens, and I wish more attorneys did this, where they don't just look at things through the legal lens, right? Like it's very easy to preach from the mountaintop and be like, here's the statute, or this is the term you must have in your contract, as opposed to saying, hey, this is how it's actually going to play out over the course of a transaction, or how it's going to play out over the course of your relationship with the tenant. Because it's very easy to say, do not pass go and file an eviction when, what's the time on that? What's the expense on that? What does that, mean for your cash? Like there's a lot of moving pieces to things than just like, here's the law, now follow it. Now, I'm not saying go out there and like break the laws, but for every legal solution, there's probably 3 business options that you could have to navigate around it.
Yeah, I love that. That's awesome. I want to transition a little bit into asset protection, right? Because I know this is something you and I have talked about a little bit offline about how the traditional asset protection, approach still leaves investors exposed. If you wouldn't mind kind of going through like, what are the tiers of asset protection and what would be your prescription to an investor to really make sure that they're protected, at least on like a base level?
That's a really great question. So my approach to asset protection stems from my lawsuits, point blank, and seeing the experience of what some of my other investor friends, what my clients have gone through. I mean, it's grown over the years, but I'll tell you this. When I started investing, I thought I had legal on lock. And let me tell you what this is, because it's probably what most investors think having legal on lock is. I had an attorney create my LLC. I had an attorney create my lease, period.
Yeah.
That was it. And I was like, I'm good. And if I have legal issues, I'll call my attorney. But that was setting myself to do just that, to call my attorney every time I had legal issues. I was sitting there playing whack-a-mole all the time and racking up the legal fees. And so I took this approach of like, well, I don't want to just protect myself from legal issues. I want to prevent them from happening in the first place. And so what does that look like? What does preventative legal look like as a real estate investor? And that looks like two different things. It looks like reactive asset protection and proactive asset protection. And reactive is largely what we think of as asset protection. That's the LLCs, that's insurance, that's maybe it's a trust in certain states or certain circumstances. Because the reason those are reactive is that they don't do diddly squat unless you have a problem pop up.
True.
They're just floating there in the background. You're paying your premiums. You're filing your annual registration with the state on your LLC, but it's just hanging out there, right? Like it's not actually doing anything to protect you.
Yeah.
On the other hand, preventative, proactive asset protection are things that we can do as real estate investors to protect ourselves from the outset. That's, I'd say, 3 or 4 key things. Number one, it's getting a baseline legal education. It's understanding the rule of law in your jurisdiction, but also how all these moving pieces work. It's understanding how LLCs work and they don't work. It's understanding how your lease works. I can't tell you how many of my clients come to me and they're like, I've never read my own lease. Yeah. You've got to understand that that's the foundational cornerstone document that you're going to try to enforce possibly in court one day. Also, contracts. Your lease is one. Your contracts with your contractors, your contracts with your partners, whether it's a partnership agreement or an operating agreement, all of those things help prevent issues from spiraling or issues from happening in the first place. Another thing that you want to have in place from a preventative standpoint is your estate plan. Now, a lot of people think of estate plans as just like your last will and testament. It's like, okay, I'm, in my 30s, I don't have to worry about that right now. But God forbid something should happen, from a tragic standpoint, but from a functional business operation standpoint, you need someone to have the legal authority to step into your shoes and keep the balls moving. And so, do you have a power of attorney? Do you have corporate resolutions giving someone authority to communicate with the your lenders, to communicate with your tenants, to be able to file an eviction on your behalf? Like all those things, if you don't have it, you're going to court to be able to appoint someone to be able to do that. And we're talking about things that might cost a few $100 to a few $1,000s versus like baseline 10 grand you're in court to be able to have those things happen. And so if you look at, asset protection of this approach of like, don't be penny-wise and pound cheap, you want to make sure at the end you're coming out ahead. Right. And there's a lot of little things that I think investors just think like, that either they don't know it exists, which is probably most often they don't even realize there's these steps they could be doing, or that they're like, oh, I'll put it down the line when I've got a portfolio that's bigger to make. But a lot of these things are a lot harder to start implementing the further down the line you go. But the nice thing is a lot of the stuff you can implement without having an attorney, like having legally compliant systems and processes. I don't have to do that for you. Right. I can point you in the right direction of saying, hey, these are the systems you should have. These are the laws you need to be looking up to make sure that whatever system you're creating is going to be enforceable. Right. But beyond that, like that's homework you've got to do as a business owner.
Yeah. That's huge. And as you were saying that, I was actually writing down a question that you answered, which was like, how much should someone budget to really start doing some of these like preventative, proactive type things? And you said, a few $100 to, a couple $1,000s maybe. But when you look at it from the long-term perspective of you end up in court, it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars. Regardless, like at that point, you're doing two things. A, you're benefiting your business by setting those things up for the long term. And B, you're already hedging your risk of possibly going into court and having to spend thousands of dollars, which, as you mentioned, you've been in court a handful of times, not just because you're an attorney, but other reasons as well. I wanted to say one other thing. Oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
I was just saying, unfortunately, those are not all. I'm not only in court because I'm an attorney.
Yes. What do you think of? And you kind of alluded to some of this a little bit at the end of that, but what do you feel about like a platform like Law Depot or Zen Business to make an LLC for an operating agreement, for contracts, stuff like that? Do you feel like for the most part it's okay, but like you expose yourself, or like are you like run and hide, don't go there?
Look, I think when it comes to something like a single member LLC, it's probably something it's pretty formulaic when it comes to that. I've never formed an LLC using like LegalZoom or Law Depot or something like that, so I can't speak to their forms specifically. Yes. But I mean, I've seen operating agreements at like the closing table from a title company where it's like, here it is, and it's like a page where it's like, I've authorized this business to be in existence and I'm the sole member, period. Could that work? Yeah. Is it as robust as it could be? Of course not. Anything that's on one page, an attorney is like, you could probably do it better. If it's a one pager, at least get it onto 2 pages, because we got a
Yes.
signature block. I mean, signature block is like half the page these days. But it doesn't have to be overly expensive. I do think I would rather see you invest in a lease. If you've got a partnership, you need to have an attorney involved. If you are creating an LLC with more than just yourself and perhaps your spouse, you should have an attorney involved, and sometimes even with your spouse.
Yeah.
Because, there can be a lot of moving pieces. I have a lot of clients who are investing couples. They can be investing together. They may not be investing together. They may want to have a prenup or a postnup. All those things are totally valid. And they're also asset protection, right?
Yeah.
If you are, investing a ton as a single person and you're entering into a marriage, it is not a shame. I'll admit, I have a prenup with my husband. He was investing before he met me. He asked me to sign a prenup, and I did. And that's fine. I totally understand where he's coming from. And it's something worth considering as part of your overall way of protecting yourself and your assets. Did I answer the question?
You did, very much so. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
I think that's clutch. So like, as an investor, let's just say like I'm buying my first house, right? And I open up my LLC. If let's say it's single member, I go through Zen Business or not, I use an attorney. What kind of like other, let's say I'm going to make this a rental, because I know you're in the Landlord Law School, which I don't want to give away all your secrets necessarily on the show, but what are some preventative actions that I could take as a landlord to ensure that I am protected in case if I have any type of issue with my tenant?
Yeah. So I think the first thing you want to do, whether you form an LLC with an attorney or with Law Depot, is do largely what I talk about in Landlord School. You got to use that LLC properly in order to get the protection that it affords. I see a lot of investors get sloppy with it. And so that means you should have clean books. Your tenant pays into a business operating account, and then you pay yourself from that business operating account. You don't skip that step and pay directly to yourself. You should have the property titled in the name of that LLC. You should have your insurance in the name of that LLC. Everything has to be matching up. And so that's the thing that I see a lot of investors don't quite have. Sometimes they, get an LLC later on, or they switch title. There's a lot of moving pieces. And so you want to make sure everything is matching up. Another thing, if you're thinking about risks coming from tenants, usually the risks coming from tenants come in a few different ways. Number one, they're damaging your property. That's asset protection. Number two, you're ending up with some sort of vacancy or eviction or something like that. Or number three, you have some sort of injury that happens on the property, whether accidental or otherwise. When we're going to go through that order, number one, if it's damage, then make sure you're taking the max security deposit. You would be surprised by how many people are not taking enough of the security deposit. If someone is damaging the property and you're aware of it in the mid-lease, handle it mid-lease. Don't wait till the end of the lease term. Now, it can be very difficult to handle this stuff post-lease. Most tenants, I don't mean to generalize, but a lot of tenants don't have other assets that you're going to be able to garnish. Maybe you're garnishing their wages, but that's, we're talking about pennies on the dollar for decades on end. It's not a real way to be able to, quickly recover that. And so a lot of that will come down to robust tenant screening from the outset. When we're thinking about turnovers, vacancies, evictions, things like that, again, a lot of it comes back to tenant screening, but some of it has to do with, are there creative solutions, right? For every eviction, can you do a payment plan? Can you just do cash for keys? Can you do some sort of just like lease termination where it's just like, we'll be gone with each other? And so back when I was doing evictions, I no longer want to do them. And so I refer all that out. But I would always tell my clients, before you pay me, a few $100s to handle this eviction, offer it to your tenant. Offer it to your tenant to see if you can do cash for keys, because that'll be faster than any sort of eviction we can get done here. And so if that doesn't work, I'd be happy to take your money
100%.
and handle it. But I'll be honest with you. I mean, it's not a fast process up here in the Northeast to get an eviction done. And so you're generally looking at about probably 6 weeks. And so if you can get someone out by the end of the month by paying them to leave, and everyone kind of has a win-win, they don't have an eviction on their record and you've got the turnover happening faster, fantastic. And then the third thing that we had talked about, risks from tenants, would be something like somebody getting hurt on a property. So number one, make sure you're not underinsured. And this goes for not just tenants getting injured. It could be someone slipping, falling, just walking past your property. Make sure you're not underinsured. Perhaps get an umbrella policy. Those are great bang for their buck, but make sure that umbrella policy insures rental properties. A lot of them don't. A lot of them do, but you want to, when you're talking with your insurance broker, make sure that they understand the type of coverage that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is make sure your property is to code, because you're only liable from a legal standpoint if you were negligent. So that means you owed a duty to someone and you breached it. And because of that breach, somebody got injured. And so it's a matter of, was there a breach of some sort of duty? The classic example of this is a missing handrail on a staircase. If you don't have a graspable handrail on a staircase, inside, outside, front step, whatever, and someone slips on that, even if everything else was totally fine, it was a total freak accident, you're probably going to be found liable to some extent, if not entirely, because that property was not built to code in a way that would have protected them. Same thing, make sure your fire alarms got batteries in them, CO2 detectors got batteries in them. I mean, every year, and unfortunately this time of year, we hear these horror stories where, unfortunately someone passes away in their rental because of a CO2 leak when the heater's on. And they'll find out, well, there weren't batteries or it wasn't hardwired or whatever the case may be. It's like that stuff is all asset protection. Yeah. There's ways you can protect yourself that is just basic property maintenance, property check-ins, upkeeps, things like that. And so those are 3 ways that I would handle those probably top three risks that can come from tenants.
Yeah, that's very, very fruitful info. And as you're saying it, my head's going, yeah, I could be better about this. I could be better about this. And again, like I said, it's just, I think sometimes, and you being an investor, like you've been there and you have this kind of dual background, which is really awesome. But as investors, like, what do we like to do? We like to buy houses. We like to renovate them. We like to make profits off of them. I think sometimes the asset protection, at least speaking from my own personal experience, the asset protection, the kind of like making sure all of our ducks in a row sometimes falls on the back burner until you get slapped with like a lawsuit or you're like, oh my gosh, like I made a massive mistake. So if anybody, yeah, go ahead, Bonnie.
There's no judgment. I was that investor too. And I literally made a career out of it because of that issue.
100%. So if you are listening, take preventative measures and be smart. Don't be, kind of shooting from the hip on a lot of these things, especially these bigger things.
Yeah, and I get it. I mean, legal is not the sexiest part of real estate investing. It is, it can be expensive. I'm not going to lie. It can be, boring. It can force you to face things that you don't want to face. And in many ways, it feels frustrating to put money towards things that don't have an immediate return. Like when you're rehabbing, you're spending way, way more than you would ever spend on an attorney. But you're like, look, here's a definitive ROI. I'm going to burr it. Right. I'm going to make an ROI on this. Whereas there's nothing quite as graspable and tangible about the protection, the legal side of things that makes it, I think, move to the top of an investor's to-do list the way that other investments in your business do.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true when you think about it in that sense. I got one more question kind of just on protection, and I'm going to transition to a few other things. Let's say, we talked about if you were a brand new investor and even not someone who has a portfolio, some preventative things that you could do and those kind of tiers. But like, if you're starting to scale, right? Are you in the boat of you should have multiple LLCs, only keep certain houses and, X amount of houses in an LLC? Are you in the boat of one LLC with more of a bigger insurance and umbrella policy? Or are you like one LLC for every single property? Like, what's your kind of opinion on that?
So my approach has always been to never let my risk tolerance substitute for my client's risk tolerance.
No doubt.
And so a lot of this is like, what's your budget? What's your financing? And what will make you feel good when you sleep at night? And also, it's important to think about the operational consequences of whatever the plan is. One LLC means one business bank account.
Yep.
10 LLCs means 10 business bank accounts, 10 QuickBooks accounts, 10 Schedule Cs. Like, it starts adding up from an operational standpoint. And if it starts getting too big that you start getting sloppy with the money and you start depositing everything in one, then you just lost the asset protection that you intended to create through all of those entities. And so I think there's a give and take when it comes to asset protection. If someone wants to create one property per LLC, have at it. I won't stop them. I probably will not be the one to talk them into that. I'll be completely honest with you. But if that's what they want to do, and that's, truly from them from an empowered place where they understand the costs involved with that, the operational effects of that, then hell yeah, let's do it. A lot of my clients take that middle ground approach of perhaps putting like some sort of monetary limit of the amount of assets that they put into a particular LLC, say $1 million, cap it, move on to the next one. It's not a perfect system, right? Because we're all hoping our properties appreciate, but it gives a general rule of thumb.
Yep.
And some of my clients have never had an LLC in their life. Like that's a fourth option that we haven't even talked about. I mean, it's really common with house hackers, people, using FHA financing. What am I going to do? Tell them they can't have their investment property because they're not using an LLC? No, of course not. But that's really common even for non-house hackers. There's plenty of people who just have properties. They use a ton of insurance. They're like, that's going to do basically what the LLC is going to do, perhaps plus some, right? Because an insurance will pay for counsel for you. And so start there.
So good, honestly. Just so like even just within little conversations, I'm like pulling myself again. This is beneficial for me. I'm like pulling so many little things, and I'm just like, you don't learn these things, you don't hear these things, you just get them from people that are also doing it. So it's great to hear you kind of talk on that. I want to talk about Landlord Law School. This is something that I've seen you talk about a lot. It seems extremely fruitful and beneficial. How did that kind of stem? Where did that come from? And what is, if I were to be someone that's a student of yours, like what do I gain from Landlord Law School?
Yeah. So Landlord Law School is coming up on 5 years, which is insane to me. That makes me think I should probably do a big promo for that. But Landlord Law School created literally out of the pandemic and literally out of need. So I had a baby shortly before the pandemic. She was, I guess, about 4 months old when the pandemic hit. And the funny thing is like a week or so prior, I was like, I'm coming back to work. This is it. And I was like, no, I'm not.
Yeah.
I think I had one closing and I was like, we're closed again.
Yeah.
But a lot of legal areas came to a halt. Real estate was sort of one of them, right? Remember back to April 1st, 2020, we had an eviction moratorium. And so I had a ton of clients who had non-payment of rent, but they couldn't do anything about it. And they were calling me freaking out. And I have a friend named Sam. She has a successful, online course and template business for online coaches and entrepreneurs. And I was like, what if I just made a template for these eviction alternatives? I make a template for a payment plan, for a mutual lease termination, and for cash for keys. Mm-hmm. And that way people may not be able to go into court, but perhaps they can, legally and confidently like work things out on the side with tenants. And so I threw that up on a website and people started buying it. It was just like a little Squarespace website. I recorded a video, I highlighted where to fill in the blanks, and that was it.
Wow.
And people loved it. And I was like, and I was like, I think I just posted on social media. I was like, what else do you guys want to learn? And I had this whole list and I was like, you know what? This is the way to proactively learn how to protect yourself. It's, because no one's going to pay a lawyer hourly to be able to do that. It financially doesn't make sense to learn hours and hours of the background and you have to go home and do homework. And I was like, what if I just made a course out of it? And so it goes through the life cycle from buying properties to getting tenants to handling turnovers to the ugly side of things with evictions and things like that from start to finish, and how to legally protect yourself, exposes what the risks are, because a lot of times people don't even realize the risks until they've experienced it themselves. And so if I can uncover what those things are, not from like I'm going to scare the shit out of you and I don't want you to be a real estate investor standpoint, but from like here's what's actually out there, here's what could happen. So I'm not going to wait for that to happen in order to protect myself from it. We're going to start from the ground up and build a solid legal foundation. So that way, as I'm scaling, or even if I'm plateauing, I'm being like, I'm comfortable with my small and mighty portfolio, then at least I feel like I know what's going on. I've done the back end work to make sure that everything is going correctly.
Yeah, that's awesome. And now I think if I remember correctly, it's more so you have it like set up in enrollments, right? So is there an enrollment period coming up, or how would necessarily somebody sign up for it?
Sure. So generally speaking, it's always available, because my thought is if you're looking to tackle legal, again, it's not the sexiest thing. Like I want you to be able to access it when you're ready to do it.
Yes.
I will occasionally do promos. I'll throw extra bonuses, but like people who are in it kind of get layered into that.
Cool.
I just re-recorded it. Since it was almost 5 years old, I was like, I think it's time to spruce it up, rethink about it. I've had, many students go through it at this point. I was like, what are the lessons learned and how can I make it better? And so more lessons, shorter, more actionable, tons of more workbooks. It's in there, and I'll make sure it's posted and available by the time this goes live.
100%. I love it. I'm going to actually just kind of kick into your 100, doors in your portfolio. As being someone who self-manages that, what are maybe like a few of your top like takeaways as being like a self-managing landlord?
Sure. So I will caveat this and say the day-to-day, which is not usually most days, but the operations are handled by my husband. I try to come in on the legal stuff. I am the queen of finding a deal,
No doubt.
but I try not, like, the tenants don't know me. They don't know I exist.
Yep.
They don't want me to exist in their life. Trust me.
100%.
If I'm getting involved, they've got bigger problems.
Yep.
And so, but I will say from like a 10,000 foot view, a few things. Number one, and I don't think we did this intentionally, it's just kind of how it worked out and how we've kind of refined the portfolio over the years, is that they're geographically basically all in one area, which makes for visiting them really easy. It makes for understanding the laws really easy. It doesn't mean those laws are easy to implement. Good Lord, Philadelphia's become a monster with landlord tenant laws, but it's there. At least it's, basically just two jurisdictions we're dealing with at this point. And it allows us to really kind of understand that market in terms of like what are rents, what's normal turnover time, what can we expect in terms of vacancies, things like that. We're really good at keeping our pulse on that side of things. Another thing that we've done is we've basically created a turnover season for ourselves. So all of our units basically turn over September 1st or August 1st. And so that way we have a busy season, basically May or June 1st, we're giving our tenants, their 90 days notice, or they're giving us their notice. Most of the time we're offering a renewal.
Yeah.
But if they're not, they're letting us know, and we're getting the property to market. We're showing it over the summer. And then since most of our properties are by students, we kind of have it lined up with the college schedule, and they turn over right around the school year for the college students.
That's clutch.
Yeah. And so for the rest of the year, we're not constantly advertising. We're not constantly showing properties. Like there's a period of time where we're in Philly all the time handling it, and then less so for the rest of the year, which is really nice. The other thing I would say is hold your guns. If something's not a good deal, don't jump it, especially in this market right now. We went from buying a lot every year to really a trickle. Particularly like the last 2 years, I think we've bought like one or two things. Okay. And so that's because we have a very defined deal box. That deal box has not changed much over the course of, the close to 15 years that we've been investing in real estate. Our expectation of what we want off of a door has not changed much. And we would rather stabilize. And I realize there's a little bit, something to say of course you can stabilize now you've got 100 doors. But I do think that it would take us off the stability that our portfolio has if we compromised on what we're looking for in a property, and it's not worth doing that just for growth's sake alone.
Yeah. Now, with the 100 doors that you have, and there was phenomenal tidbits that you threw in there, like, are they mostly single families, small multis, 2 to 4 units, or are you picking up some bigger unit properties?
They're mostly small multis. I'd say more in the like 3 to 6 unit range.
Okay.
That's just kind of how things are built in Philly.
Yeah.
We do have a handful of single families. Not my preference, not something I look for. There are some of just like older properties, things that we've lived in the past, things that we've just kind of held on to. They cash flow nice, and so it didn't really make sense to get rid of them. But they're not something we actively try to look for. We do have some commercial in there. I do like commercial, probably like it more now because just the
easier to project.
Yeah, longer term tenants, less turnover.
Yeah.
And just the way that the landlord tenant laws are up here, it's nice to have a lot more flexibility in terms of lease terms and eviction rights and things like that. It's never been an issue with our commercial properties, thank God, but it's kind of just nice to have that wiggle room. I mean, with the good comes the bad. Typically vacancies will be longer in a commercial standpoint.
Right.
But we haven't had that issue so far.
No doubt. Well, cool. It's funny because I feel like I hear a lot of people say like, oh, like I'll get, X amount of doors, and then I'll pivot to sell this to go to apartments or jump into the next thing. It seems like for the past 15 years, you guys have just been consistently accumulating in that buy box, that wheelhouse of the 3 to 6 units, a little bit of commercial, some single families. What do you project moving forward? Is it just going to continue to buy in that buy box, or do you think you'll ever kind of venture into some bigger stuff or maybe sell it off? What are you projecting?
The only thing that we've thought of doing outside of that is development. And that's just
Yeah.
because a number of opportunities have crossed our plates. I'll say as an attorney, one thing that's nice is that people will sometimes come to me and be like, hey, I have this property. What do you want? What would you want to get involved with it? What do you think I should do with it? And a lot of times we pass on it. Like it just doesn't make sense or it's not
Yep.
like geographically where we'd want to be. But it happens a lot. And development is something that I'm really interested in. It's something way outside the wheel zone of what we're doing. But I don't I'm kind of intrigued by the challenge of it. I also would probably do that with the intention to sell. I don't know that we would develop with the intention to hold on to those things as rentals. Some of that is just like the nature of the way development goes in this area and what they're looking to have built as well.
Yeah.
Um, I have never had the intention. We joke about it. I mean, every now and then we'll see, a building that looks like it has maybe like 60 units in it. And we're like, what if we just sold everything and had one building and that was it? Like that's
Yeah.
all we needed. It was just that one building. We joke about it, but I don't know. It works right now.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things where if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't think that the grass is always greener. I've seen that happen a lot where people will sell off their whole portfolio and be like, I'm going to be a syndicator now. I've never had syndicator aspirations. I question a lot of the deals that syndicators have been bringing, and we've been seeing that, as this debt bubble is rapidly approaching. And I wish everybody all the best, and I hope everybody makes all the money that they're anticipating. But there's just a lot of speculation, I think, that's been going on with a lot of syndicators, and that's not the route that I would intend to go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I thought that syndication would be a route that like my partner Steve and I would get into, and I started reading some books on it. And I actually went to like a whole like conference about it or whatever in Dallas last year. And I just remember leaving there and I just felt just like it wasn't very good, honestly. It was more so just like, I just felt like, I feel like I'm losing a lot of ownership in there. There's a lot of moving parts and maybe something down the line, like you said, that I might end up getting into a little bit, but at this moment, it's not necessarily what I thought it would be. And I think being where you are right now, you probably are attesting in the same sense.
Yeah. And I mean, some of this is also just, I love and respect the grit and the work and the care that small landlords provide in a way that complexes or these large buildings just can't and won't offer. Like once you've got it under this management company that just doesn't know the tenants, doesn't care, doesn't have any sort of flexibility, then it loses some of that niceness
Yeah.
of also having like someone local and close to properties. It you lose something in the community. That doesn't mean it's all bad. I think it is all bad. I mean, there's a need for all of these types of investors, I think, to be in the market. But I really love the role that we get to play in housing.
Yeah, and actually, I'm thinking back on that conference that I went to, and there was a CPA that spoke there. His name was Tom Wheelwright, and he's fantastic. I read his book, but he actually said something there. He said, "Get rich in your niche," and it's like you found your niche, Bonnie, and that's where you are. That's where you're comfortable. I feel very similar. So like, don't fix something that's not broken. Essentially, in that sense of what you were saying, exactly. We're just talking about like scaling, talking about building, talking about asset protection. I know you and I have kind of briefly spoke about this, but like, where did you look for inspiration? Because I know you had said that as one of your points, like look to other industries for inspiration. Where did you look for inspiration as you were kind of getting into everything that you're doing?
So I'll answer this question in two parts. I'll talk about like our personal inspiration for the portfolio and also talk about like my inspiration behind like my asset protection approach.
Yeah.
So in terms of inspiration for the getting into real estate investing was we had a number of friends who we knew early on who were investing, and I kind of liked that through like the ups and downs of life or career changes or whatever, like that was a stable thing that they had in their background. I never really thought about it at the time, but my grandparents, my mom's parents, were actually real estate investors.
Oh, no doubt.
Instead of an engagement ring, my grandmother got a duplex
Wow.
before they got married. Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
And so like they were the OG house hackers back in like the early 60s.
That's crazy.
And so yeah, I mean, I kind of looked at that and I was like, that's a really beautiful way for them to have started their marriage,
Yeah.
was having that kind of initial wealth that they had. And then they had, a little duplex down in the shore that they rented out. And they had the other house that they used to live in Northeast Philadelphia was another. And so I think they had, maybe it was like 4 or 6 doors total. But,
Yeah.
pushing into their 70s and then 80s, it was, a nice little supplement to their otherwise, my grandfather worked for the Philadelphia Department of Education. So he had a little pension there. My grandmother was a homemaker. And so it was a little bit of extra money so they could take their cruises. And so I kind of saw these little bits and pieces of the way that real estate can really be a blessing, really, really be a blessing. And when I met my husband, that wasn't, what attracted me to him, but it was something that just kind of fell into our relationship. And I'm really glad that it did.
Yeah.
When it comes to the inspiration, looking outside the box for asset protection, I think that there's this conception, and you hear it a lot in like a lot of these like asset protection type gurus, where it's like we are some sort of special snowflake as real estate investors. We are walking, breathing, living targets. We are going to get sued up and down. And I mean, I've been sued. I've been there. Like I know that there is, a bit of a target on our back because they know that there's a payout, right? Behind every property is the property itself and probably an insurance company, an insurance payout. And so there is a little bit of more of a guarantee if you're looking at it from a personal injury standpoint. But my thought was like, we're not the only businesses who get sued. Hospitals get sued all the time. Amazon gets sued all the time. There's a million different ways to get sued. And if you actually look at, I have this pie chart that I often share where it's the breakdown of the types of lawsuits that are filed every year in the country. It's like 7% are injury lawsuits. And the vast majority of them are going to be car accidents, right? Also within there are things like employment discrimination and things like slip and falls. But like we are so stressed about this 7% that we're missing the other 93%.
Right.
And about half of that 93% is contract disputes. And so if our most likely lawsuit as a human being, as an American, is going to be a contract dispute, what do you need to protect yourself and make sure that you're coming out on top? And I found that myself as a real estate investor and most of my clients are vastly underdocumented. They have too much going on phone calls. They don't have enough getting, signatures on things that should have signatures. And so you want to avoid the situation that I was in where it was a he said, she said. Those are impossible. And, our insurance company ultimately settled that for basically nuisance value, something, that's generally speaking about 10% of the claimed value. It's something to be like, it's not worth paying lawyers to fight this out. We're going to give you something to make you go away. And so through that, I was like, well, what do these other companies do that get sued all the time as well? They know the laws. They have their contracts in place. They enforce their systems and processes. And then they kind of live and let be. Like they're not in business constantly stressing about, what could happen. They're in business to make money or to make a change or see whatever impact that their business set out to do. Right. And so that really was the impetus of my creating of this approach of proactive asset protection, because I don't believe you should be living in fear about, this boogeyman of, people just slipping and falling all over. Because I feel like that's the big one, or, someone, falling down the stairs or whatever, your worst nightmare is that you have in your head about how things can go wrong at rentals. But it really can be just something where it's like, hey, I'm going to look at it like a business. I'm going to treat it like a business. And with that comes some risk, but I've prepared for that risk and we're going to keep on moving on.
Yeah. That's like funny. It reminds me of like one of the first tenants that I had. Like I put in the lease that, they're responsible for like snow and removal and like icing and all that stuff. But I was like in the area and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to ice for them. Like, you know what I mean? And I laid down ice. It looked basically like it snowed because every square inch was covered with like this rock ice or whatever it was. Because I was just so paranoid getting this. I'm like, gosh, a slip and fall lawsuit. Like I don't need this on my hands right now. And I think that's probably for the most part, how a lot of people are. And I think ultimately, like, it's not a bad thing to be that way because it just shows you obviously are taking it serious and like you're focused on that. But I think to your point, it's like, if you could implement these preventative processes into your business, now all of a sudden you're not thinking about that and your primary focus is on doing what you actually set out to do, right? What you're actually executing within your business, which I think is huge. And I know that you wrote this one down too. When I was kind of probing you for some stuff, like don't wait until you're big to start implementing asset protection. Would you mind going into that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I see this a lot, and it's just anecdotally, a lot of my investors will come to me for asset protection somewhere around like the 10 building mark, where they're like,
Mm,
"Oh shoot, like I've never, thought about using an LLC, or I've got kids now, or I just I realized that, my buddy got sued or whatever." There's something about like 10-ish doors, give or take, that has people realizing I've got something to lose, and perhaps I've built a house of cards. Whereas perhaps with one property, like, oh, I've just got one, like chances
yeah.
are everything will be fine. But I can't tell you how many times on the House of Horrors podcast that people are calling me and talking to me about the first property gone sideways.
Yes.
Um, and so that's the thing. Like the risk doesn't change. Perhaps it becomes more and more likely the longer you're in it and the more properties you have, because you just have more touch points for that to happen.
Mhm.
But it shouldn't be something that you put off. One, because I think it's not as expensive as most people think it is. It's also something that is a lot harder a lot of times to fix down the line.
Right.
For example, in New Jersey, we don't have this issue as much, but in Philly, there's a transfer tax on moving a property from your personal name to an LLC. New Jersey, usually not. And so there, it could be really, really expensive to do this down the line,
Right.
especially as properties appreciate. And so you want to think about that. You want to think about your financing from the outside. You kind of want to have these touch points where you're like, all right, where am I going? What am I doing? And am I protected for it? And ask yourself that a lot.
Yeah.
That's probably one of two things that I go through is like, is everything we're doing protected and it's running, operating? Have I started something new that I really should be thinking about more carefully? The other thing is that you want to make sure that you're protected all around for all the activities that you're doing.
Right. No, I think that's really clutch. Well, I know we're running a little low on time here. This has been absolutely phenomenal. I think honestly, I'm going to go back and listen to this episode myself, which I rarely ever do for some of the episodes I record. But any last, before we talk about where people can find you, any last minute thoughts or pieces of advice or anything along those lines?
The number one thing I would just say is learn how to be your own best advocate. That doesn't mean you have to learn how to be an attorney, but you should be able to hold your own, ask questions, be able to see if there's different approaches that can happen, and be able to kind of vet your own team. And that's not just lawyers. Vet your property manager, vet your contractors, vet your partners, because all of those are probably the most likely way that
Yeah,
you're going to end up in legal, an illegal nightmare. It's not in all likelihood going to be some sort of slip and fall. It'll be some sort of partnership or tenant dispute or something with a contractor.
for sure. And where can people find you, Bonnie?
I probably spend too much time on Instagram at Bonnie Galam ESQ. Otherwise, I have a weekly newsletter. I've got the House of Horrors podcast. There's all sorts of ways you can come find me and hang out with me.
Yes. And one thing I will add, actually, because I do plan on dropping this before, I believe you're speaking at South Jersey Real Estate Investors Group on February 6th, correct?
I am. We're going to
Cool.
talk all about estate planning for investors because it's something I realized too many of you have not handled yet. And so we're going to talk about things like how do you plan for assets that you own with a partner? How do you handle properties that are owned in multiple states? All these little funky situations that the average Joe perhaps doesn't have to deal with. But, we're not the average Joe. We're out there trying to carve a unique life for ourselves, go off the beaten path a little bit. But that also requires a little bit of off the beaten path legal strategy.
Absolutely. If you guys have any questions about that event, feel free to DM me, Frankie D'Astoli _REI. I'll get you all the details. I am on the planning committee now for South Jersey Real Estate Investors Group. The fact that I had to ask the exact date to Bonnie, though, just shows that I am not doing my part as much as I should in the planning committee. So I will be getting better at that. But Bonnie, very, very excited to have you out there. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait to talk again.
Thanks so much, Frankie. This was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thanks.